Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Art Tipaldi, editor of Blues Review magazine, the largest blues magazine in the world. And tonight we're here at Don Odells' Legends interviewing Nick Moss, who was the cover story on the March issue of Blues Review in 2010. Nick, welcome to Don Odells' Legends.
Thanks a lot, Art.
Yeah,
Good to be here.
Now I got two CDs I'm holding up here. I've got Nick's previous CD called Privileged, and I've got his brand new CD called Here I Am. And I wanted to start by asking you the direction of these two CDs for someone who we consider a blues man. The direction on these new CDs seems to go a little bit to the left.
Yeah, you know, they're more contemporary, I guess is the word, from what most people, you know, would consider my music in the past was more traditional Chicago blues. So these are definitely more contemporary.
What does that satisfy in you as an artist, as a musician, to record something like Privilege, which is, you know, very rock oriented?
Yeah, well, you know, like when I did Privilege, my intent was to finally, at one point in my career, to go back and show people exactly where I came from, which was, you know, I didn't start listening to blues as a small kid and went, well, you know, I'm the biggest Muddy Waters fan in the world or whatever.
Yeah.
I did pretty much like everyone else, man. My uncle, who was my dad's younger brother, was more like an older brother to Joe, my real brother, and myself, and he would turn us on to bands like Blind Faith and Traffic and Led Zeppelin and Jimi Hendrix and the Beatles and all this music when we were kids. You know, I grew up in the 70s and early 80s, you know, and that's the stuff that my uncle was turning us on to, and it kind of turned my brother and I, you know, turned our heads enough because we realized at some point, my older brother did, that the music that my uncle was feeding us was based off the music that my mom and dad were listening to and made us listen to as kids. You know, my mom had a great R&B and blues collection in the house because she liked all kinds of music growing up on the south side of Chicago. But, you know, to us that was old people's music, and we were listening to, you know, young people's music that my uncle was giving us, until finally it dawned on us one day that, hey, this is kind of like the same stuff that mom and dad are listening. And then, you know, back in those days when you had like Cream magazine and, you know, those were the big rock magazines before Guitar Player and Guitar World and stuff. They'd have articles and you'd hear Jimmy Page talking about Otis Rush and Willie Dixon, and we're like, oh, who are these guys? And then we realized mom had some of these guys in her collection. And
they were living, you know, within...
And growing up just outside of Chicago, it was like, you know, finally at one point, you know, my brother, you know, was like, hey, that's our backyard, you know, we should probably go check this out. And my mom was cool enough to take my brother and I downtown to when they used to have Chicago Fest before the Chicago Blues Fest. They used to have Chicago Fest on Navy Pier, and we went down there. Muddy Waters was playing.
Oh man!
I mean, I was 12 years old.
You
know, it was before he died, and you know, bands like that were playing, and you know, Big Twist and the Mellow Fellows were big back then in Chicago, and you know, there was so much cool stuff that we derived from the rock music that my uncle turned us on to. So getting back, that's what my goal for Privilege was, to just kind of go back and say, you know, all these records that you know me for in the previous, I didn't start just listening to Howlin' Wolf and Jimmy Rogers and Earl Hooker. But people like Jimmy Page and Jimi Hendrix and you know, Blind Faith and Spencer Davis Group turned me on to these guys.
So let me honor those influences in me.
It was just so much fun making that record, you know, kind of getting my rocks off, playing a little bit more rock stuff, and I kind of had an epiphany too as I was making the record and playing the songs live, that you know, deep in my heart, I'll always be a traditional Chicago blues player, because those were the guys that taught me how to play the music correctly in the right way and give it all the respect that it deserves. But I realized after playing, you know, almost 20 years of doing that, that I was kind of almost like, you know, I don't know the word I'm looking for, but it was just a white guy playing traditional blues music is not as well received as, you know, an African American guy.
Right.
I mean, don't get me wrong. There's a lot of great guys doing it that are white, you know, but it just, I sensed in the audience that they weren't
responding.
I don't think they believed it as much.
Okay.
They didn't believe it as much.
Yeah.
And I really found that out when I was touring on my previous CD, which was Live at Chan's Volume 2, where I had Larry Bell with me.
Yeah.
And I said this story before, it was like we would go out and play essentially the same material that Larry was going to come play a half an hour later. And we would get over because people liked what we were doing and they know it. But then Larry would come up, and of course Larry is just an incredible guitar player and heartfelt singer, so I'm not taking any of that away, which could have been probably maybe some of it too.
Yeah.
But still, the reception was so much different than what we got, than what he got.
Right.
And then later on in the night, I had already been playing this record.
Yeah.
I would start sneaking some of the new, some more rocked up material, and all of a sudden I was going over like huge.
Oh yeah.
The audience was like almost telling me, well, that's what you're supposed to be doing.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah.
You know.
That is quite an epiphany. Yeah.
And
does it change? Does that change the way you play then the traditional Chicago blues after that experience? Does it bring up something different in you to get over? No. Okay.
No, I mean, when I want to play traditional blues, I can go right back on that bicycle and pedal it right down the street like I always have, because like I said, those guys, they kind of instilled in me the right respect for that music to have. And I'm like a contradiction in myself, where like I always felt like I don't think that the best traditional blues music had to change or evolve. I believe that all music should evolve. Yeah. But I also have a belief that like the great stuff, the golden stuff, like the proven stuff, doesn't need to evolve. Right. And it should stay in that state and be preserved in that state. But then there's another part of me that says, well, if you can do it and do it in a way where you don't feel like you're cheating anyone and you don't feel like you're diminishing what you believe in, why not give it a shot and see if it works? Yeah. And that's kind of what I've been balancing lately, is trying to do that.
Well, I know you and I, when we last talked, we talked about that phrase, tradition should be a guide, not a jailer. Right. And it sounds like, you know, you're trying to let the tradition guide you into some new interpretation, but still having the respect for the Chicago blues and the traditions of that. This has been a really hard year for you, because I know you've lost so many dear friends. You lost Fuzz, Calvin Fuzz Jones about a year ago, and then you lost Willie Big Eyes Smith.
That was a rough one.
And I know both of those guys, you've talked to me about their effect on you when you, after you left Jimmy Dawkins' band, you joined up with the legendary band, which was run by Willie.
I basically took Fuzz's place because Fuzz wanted to retire.
Yeah. And how'd that go when you first, because you were a bass player first.
I started as a bass player, and it was, you know, playing with Jimmy Dawkins was great. It was an eye-opener just because, you know, I realized how much I had to learn. Yeah. And Jimmy was a great guy and gracious enough to keep me in his band as long as he did, but he put the foot in my ass because he's the one that told me, I like you and you're a nice guy, but you know, I can't use a nice guy on stage, man. You don't know enough. Yeah. And that was like, you know, what my dad had always told me as a kid, you know, which I always let go in one ear and out the other, which was, if you're going to do something, do it all the way, don't do it half-ass. Yeah. And so that was like someone else besides my dad telling me basically the same thing, and I went, well, maybe he's right. And I went and I woodshedded, and you know, I went to see every bass player I could go see, and I would go sit in front of Calvin Fuzz Jones, I would go sit in front of Willie Black, I'd go sit in front of Bob, you know, and all these great, you know, killer bass players, you know, that I could go sit in front of and watch them play. And then when I eventually got the call from actually Melvin Smith, you had mentioned Melvin, because he couldn't do the job. Yeah. He had a prior engagement. He was playing with Coco.
Yeah, Coco Taylor.
And Coco Taylor, and he recommended me. And so I did my very first tour with the Legendary Blues Band, and I got a call from Willie and said, "Can you go on tour?" And I said, "Yeah, man, I'd love to. And when are we leaving? Tonight." And okay, well, for how long? 6 weeks. So can you make it? And I said, "Yeah, I just got to do some laundry. So you got to be at my house at midnight. I'm leaving without you."
Yeah.
And so, man, I washed whatever clothes I could gather and grabbed my bass and got down to Willie's house. And the first tour was, I took a beating. You know, every night Willie looking at me and telling, you know, basically guiding me where to be, you know, where the pocket was, where he was playing.
Right.
And by the end of the tour, I was sure that I wasn't going to be asked to come back. And and he just said, "You know what, man? You know, you don't play exactly like Fuzz." He goes, "But you got something. I think I'll keep you. If you're willing to work at it." And I said, "Yeah, I'm willing to work at it."
Yeah.
And we had about 2 weeks off between that tour and the next one. And I went and Fuzz was still playing on Sunday nights with Sunnyland Slim at Blues.
Yeah.
So I would go down there and I'd see Fuzz play Steve Freund on guitar, you know, and I would go watch him play, and I'd ask Fuzz, "Man, will you show me what you're doing, man, when you walk?" He had this way of walking his bass lines up the neck instead of across the neck. A lot of bass players play across the neck when they walk their line. Fuzz liked to walk up the neck.
Okay.
Which actually does something to your timing. Some guys might disagree with me, but I'm telling you it does. And when you play Chicago blues, there's a distinct lag feel. Muddy said there was a lag time feel. It's a behind the beat feel.
Yeah.
And when you play up the neck, it kind of slows you down a little bit and makes you kind of play behind the beat. And once I figured that out, I remember going on that first tour, and the very first night, Willie kept staring at me after about the third song. In between songs, he goes, "I don't know what the hell you did." He goes, "But you got it now, boy." And I went, "Wow, thanks."
Yeah. Cool. And then I know you told me after that you ended up with Jimmy Rogers for 3 years.
Yeah, Jimmy. I got the call to play with Jimmy.
Were you playing bass with Jimmy, or had you switched
No,
guitar
I had already switched guitar with Willie because our guitar player at the time, a fellow named Willie Greason, or Willie Phillips, he had some issues that he had to deal with and couldn't tour anymore. And Big Eyes just knew that I wanted to be a guitar player because we would switch up every now and then. I had been playing a little bit of guitar here and there with the other guitar player.
Right.
And he just figured, like, well, you know, it'll be easier to you play guitar and teach a bass player than have to teach a guitar player the stuff.
Right. Yeah.
So he moved me over to guitar, and we hired a bass player, and I kind of showed the bass player what Willie wanted. And then they both, Willie and Jimmy, were both on a Muddy Waters tribute tour over in Europe together for about 3 months. So my band and Jimmy's band were kind of left sitting at home doing nothing.
Yeah.
And the way I recall it was that Jimmy had to come home early from a tour from that Muddy Waters tribute tour to start his own tour in the States.
Yeah.
And Willie and the fellas continued, but Willie said, "Hey, my guys are sitting at home if you need anyone." And it just so happened at that time that little Jimmy Lane, was wanting to go out on his own at that time.
Okay.
And so I got a call from Jimmy Rogers.
Wow.
On Willie's recommendation, and actually another musician, a guy named Dave Clark, who a great guitar player and a great saxophone player, who was well known to play with a lot of those guys in the 80s, with Sam Lane, Jimmy Rogers, and all those. And in fact, Dave, I had just played the night before a gig with Dave Clark, and Dave was complaining that he was upset he couldn't do this tour with Jimmy Rogers because he had to watch his kid for the summer, and it was his turn to have the kid. And
boy, for somebody who is as young as you are, relatively speaking, you got to stand with the legends of Chicago blues.
Yeah, man, I had a lot of good fortune, you know, getting recommendations, and, you know.
And you worked hard, too.
I did work hard, man, and I think a lot of it was just I was pretty naive, or I don't want to say naive. Maybe I just didn't realize how heavy of an opportunity it was, so it didn't. It didn't faze me. It didn't make me nervous. I probably, like, looking back on it, it makes me realize wow, I got a chance to play with these guys.
That's right.
But at that time, it was just, man, I'm getting a chance to play music and play the kind of music I like. And these guys are showing me all this cool stuff.
Yeah, yeah. You know, I was never a friend of Willie Big Eye Smith. Normally when there'd be a gig, he'd always have people who'd be, you know, his long-time friends. So I just sort of hung back and admired him from a distance. But I'll tell you, going down to King Biscuit this year and watching all the tributes and watching Kenny and Stroger and Bob Margolin, I felt like, boy, did I miss an opportunity to know what must have been one of the great human beings around.
I always tell people he was more like a second father to me than anything, because you know, I love my dad, but I can, you know, honestly say that we didn't always have the greatest relationship. My dad was, you know, a strict guy, and he expected things a certain way.
Right.
And being a teenager and a young guy, me and my brother weren't always the you know, the greatest practitioners of what he wanted us to do. Right. But I'll tell you what, being with Willie and all the things that he taught me on the road, not just music, it made me appreciate my dad more, because it was a lot of the same stuff that my dad was saying, and I kind of realized at that time that, wow, you know, that's the same thing.
That's right. Yeah.
You know.
Right. Well, thank you. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, this is Nick Moss, who has a brand new album, a brand new CD out called Here I Am, on the Blue Bella label, which is Nick Moss's own label. In addition to being a great musician, Nick is also the founder and owner of his own label that puts out CDs for himself, the Kilbourne Alley Blues Band, Jerry Hunt,
Bill Lupkin.
Bill Lupkin. How many CDs total on the label?
I can't remember.
15
we got,
maybe?
We, you know.
So
Matt, you know.
Who's the other one?
I said we've got. Now you got me stumbling here.
Yeah, that's right. So once again,
Matt Stubbs. Excuse me.
That's
Sorry,
right, Matt Stubbs. Yeah. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, I'm Art Tipaldi, editor of Blues Review magazine. We've just been listening to Nick share some wonderful stories about the people he learned the music from. Right now, enjoy the show with Nick Moss. Thank you, Nick.
You're welcome.